The Oklahoma wind, in the summer of 1943, carried two things in abundance: dust and the deafening roar of artillery. This was Fort Sill, the great American school of fire, where the sons of farmers, merchants, and factory workers were being taught the brutal arithmetic of the big guns. It was a place of thunder and precision, a world run by slide rules, protractors, and the unquestionable authority of the field manual. And in the heart of this world, a young woman from the mountains of West Virginia was quietly breaking all the rules. Her name was Corporal Maggie Suttree. She was small and wiry, with clear, steady blue eyes that seemed to see things other people missed. She had grown up in the deep, dark hollers of Appalachia, where her father, a coal miner with a quiet love for hunting, had taught her how to shoot. But Maggie's gift wasn't with a rifle. It was with trajectory, with the unseen arc of a falling object. She could throw a stone and hit a tin can on a fence post from 100 yards away. She could look at a hillside and instinctively know the path a rolling log would take. To Maggie, gravity wasn't a law in a physics book. It was a feeling, a song she could hear in her bones. When the war came, she enlisted in the Women's Army Corps. Her uncanny abilities were quickly noticed, and in a move that baffled the Army's bureaucracy, the quiet girl from the mountains was sent to the home of the big guns. She was assigned to a training battery for the new M1 155mm howitzer, a monstrous cannon the men called the Long Tom. Maggie was an anomaly, a whisper of a woman in a world of bellowing men. She was supposed to be a clerk, a telephone operator. Instead, she was on the gun line, and her talent was as undeniable as it was unsettling. While the other recruits, mostly men, struggled with the complex calculations of range, windage, and elevation, Maggie just knew. She would look at the target area miles away, listen to the wind, feel the humidity in the air, and call out corrections that were impossibly, miraculously accurate. Her gun crew, a rough-and-tumble group of city boys, had nicknamed her the Witch. They said it with a mixture of awe and affection, but her gift did not endear her to her commanding officer, Second Lieutenant Arthur Wallace. Wallace was everything Maggie was not. He was tall, handsome, and carried the crisp, unshakable confidence of a man who had graduated near the top of his class at West Point. He believed that war was a science, a problem to be solved with mathematics and discipline. To him, the field manual was gospel, and Maggie Suttree was a heretic. He could not accept that this uneducated, quiet woman from a place he couldn't find on a map could be a better gunner than his best-trained men. He saw her intuitive, almost mystical approach not as a talent, but as a dangerous, undisciplined habit. He was convinced she was a fluke, a lucky guesser, or worse, a cheat. The conflict between them came to a head during a live fire competition. The batteries were competing for accuracy, firing at targets 5 miles away on the vast Oklahoma prairie. Wallace's battery was doing poorly. The wind was tricky, shifting in unpredictable gusts. His gunners, following their books and their instruments, were consistently missing the mark. Finally, in desperation, the sergeant of Maggie's gun crew put her on the sights. "Let the witch have a look," he muttered. Maggie stepped up to the gun. She didn't consult the charts. She didn't look at the wind gauge. She closed her eyes for a moment, her head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. Then her eyes snapped open. "Up 2 degrees, she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Left 1.5. The gunner, a young man who trusted Maggie more than he trusted his lieutenant, made the adjustments. The gun roared. 10 seconds later, the distant radio crackled to life. The forward observer's voice was filled with disbelief. "Direct hit! I say again, direct hit. Right in the bullseye!" Maggie called out 2 more corrections for 2 more guns. Both were perfect dead-center hits. Her battery won the competition. But instead of praise, she earned Lieutenant Wallace's cold, undiluted fury. He could not stand to be shown up, especially not by her. He called her into his office that afternoon. The small wooden building smelled of stale coffee and his own indignation. "I don't know how you did it, Corporal," he began, his voice a low, angry hum. "I don't know if you're counting seconds or watching the smoke from the other guns or if you just have the devil's own luck. But I do not believe in magic. I believe in procedure. And you do not follow procedure. Sir, I can feel it." Maggie tried to explain, her voice faltering under his icy glare. I can see the path of the shell in my head. Wallace let out a short, contemptuous laugh. You can feel it? This is the United States Army, Corporal, not a backwoods prayer meeting. Your feelings are a liability. What happens when your feelings are wrong? People die. Discipline saves lives. The manual saves lives. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. You are a danger to the morale and discipline of this unit. The men are starting to think there's some kind of shortcut to being a good soldier. There isn't. There is only training, repetition, and following orders. You undermine that. From that day on, Lieutenant Wallace made it his personal mission to break her. He could not deny her test scores, but he could make her life a living hell. He removed her from the gun line permanently. He assigned her to the most demeaning, mind-numbing tasks he could devise. She spent her days counting shell casings in a sweltering tin warehouse, repainting warning signs and cleaning the battery's latrines. It was a public and deliberate humiliation, a message to everyone that her talent meant nothing in the face of his authority. Maggie took the punishment with a quiet, uncomplaining dignity that only seemed to infuriate Wallace more. The work was hard and lonely, but she did it without a word of protest. The other men in her gun crew, who had seen her brilliance firsthand, were angry, but they were powerless. Wallace was an officer, and his word was law. Maggie's only solace was Master Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was a lifer, a veteran of the First World War who had forgotten more about artillery than Lieutenant Wallace would ever know. He had seen Maggie shoot, and he knew a true gift when he saw one. He despised Wallace's arrogant, by-the-book blindness. He would find Maggie late at night, long after the other soldiers were in their bunks in a forgotten corner of the motor pool. She had built a small, crude catapult out of scrap wood and surgical tubing. She was launching rocks at an old oil drum, practicing her art, keeping her gift alive in the only way she could. He's a fool, you know, Miller said one night, his voice a low rumble as he watched her fling another rock in a perfect, silent arc through the darkness. A dangerous fool. He thinks a war is fought on a blackboard. He's going to get a lot of men killed someday. He's the lieutenant, Sergeant, Maggie said, her eyes fixed on the distant target. That he is, Miller grunted, but that don't make him right. He watched her for a moment longer. Don't you ever lose that, kid. That thing you've got, the world's going to try to beat it out of you. Don't you let it. But the world, in the form of Lieutenant Wallace, kept trying. He blocked her applications for officer candidate school, writing in his evaluation that she lacked the requisite intellectual discipline for command. He denied her requests for a transfer to a combat unit, citing her unpredictable and emotional approach to gunnery. He was building a paper wall around her, trapping her in a prison of his own prejudice. She was the best gunner at Fort Sill, a prodigy who could perform feats of calculation by pure instinct. And she was being systematically erased, her talent buried under a mountain of menial labor and the petty tyranny of a man who feared what he could not understand. As the unit prepared for deployment to Europe, Maggie was listed on the roster not as a gunner, but as a records clerk and assistant quartermaster. Lieutenant Wallace had won. He had taken her gift, the one thing that made her special, and he had locked it away in a filing cabinet. The crossing of the Atlantic was a gray, miserable affair. The sea and the sky were the same shade of cold, wet steel. For the men of the battery, it was a time of nervous excitement and seasickness. For Corporal Maggie Suttree, it was a continuation of her exile. She spent the journey in the ship's hold, counting crates of K-rations and blankets, the rhythmic throb of the engines a constant reminder of how far she was from the guns. They landed in England, and were immediately swept up in the massive, continent-sized build-up for the invasion of France. Their new home was a muddy field in southern England, a temporary camp of canvas tents under a perpetually weeping sky. Lieutenant Wallace drilled the gun crews relentlessly, his voice sharp and demanding as he forced them to rehearse the precise, clockwork procedures of the manual. Maggie, meanwhile, was assigned to the motor pool, where she spent her days checking tire pressures and changing the oil in the trucks that would haul the big guns. She was a ghost in the machine, a vital but unseen part of the operation. She kept the trucks running perfectly, But every time she heard the distant, familiar roar of the howitzers during practice, it was a fresh twist of the knife in her heart. She was a warrior who had been forced to beat her sword into a dipstick. After the D-Day landings, the unit was shipped across the Channel to Normandy. They followed the advance inland, moving from one devastated French field to another. The war, for them, was still a distant thing, a rumbling on the horizon, the sight of high-flying bombers, and the endless columns of wounded men and shattered equipment moving back from the front. In the late autumn of 1944, they were moved to a new sector, a quiet, forgotten corner of the front lines in the Ardennes forest, near the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. It was a place of breathtaking, silent beauty. The rolling hills were covered in a dense, dark forest of pine and fir trees that swallowed sound and played tricks on the eyes. The men called it the Ghost Front. The fighting here had stagnated months ago, and a strange, unspoken truce seemed to have settled over the landscape. Their position was on a low ridge overlooking a narrow, winding river valley. It was a perfect artillery position, with clear lines of sight to the German-held hills on the other side. But there was nothing to shoot at. The war had gone somewhere else. The men grew complacent, their days falling into a dull routine of guard duty, maintenance, and writing letters home. Lieutenant Wallace, however, saw the quiet sector as an opportunity to perfect his battery's discipline. He drilled them on setting up and breaking down the guns, on communications protocols, and on camouflage. He was a man preparing for a textbook battle in a place where the battle had already ended. But Maggie felt something different. Her mountain senses, honed by a childhood spent in the deep, quiet woods of West Virginia, were on high alert. The silence of the Ardennes was not a peaceful silence. It was a watchful silence, a silence that felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. She would walk the perimeter of their position in the evenings, after her work in the motor pool was done. She listened. She heard things the other soldiers missed. The cry of a bird that sounded wrong, the distant muffled sound of engines, a low hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth, a sound that was there one moment and gone the next. The strange lack of deer and other large animals in a forest that should have been teeming with them. She tried to tell Lieutenant Wallace about her concerns. She found him one evening in the command tent, poring over his neatly drawn maps under the yellow glow of a single lantern. "Sir," she began, her voice hesitant, "I think something's wrong. The forest is too quiet, and I keep hearing engines at night, faintly, from over there." She pointed eastward, toward the German lines. Wallace didn't even look up from his map. "Corporal, what you are hearing is the echo of our own supply trucks from the main road 10 miles away bouncing off the hills. It's a common acoustic phenomenon in this type of terrain. It's in the manual section on auditory illusions." "No, sir," Maggie insisted. "This is different. It's not our trucks. It sounds heavier, and the sound is coming from the ground, not the air. And the animals are gone. It's like they've been scared away by something." Wallace finally looked up, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Corporal Suttree," he said, as if speaking to a small, imaginative child. "You are not a trained reconnaissance scout. You are a clerk. Your job is to keep track of the fuel consumption of the trucks, not to interpret the mating calls of the local squirrels. We have intelligence reports from division headquarters. This sector is quiet. The only Germans over there are a few tired, under-equipped Volksgrenadier units. They are not a threat." He turned back to his maps, a clear dismissal. "Please confine your observations to your assigned duties. I have a real war to plan for." The injustice of it was a bitter pill. She had been right at Fort Sill, and he had punished her. She felt with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was right now, and he was dismissing her again. His arrogance was going to be the death of them all. Her only ally was again Master Sergeant Miller. He had seen too much of war to believe in quiet sectors. He listened to Maggie's concerns, his weathered face creased with worry. "You keep listening, kid," he told her in a low voice. "You trust what your gut is telling you. The day you stop trusting, that is the day you die over here." He took it upon himself to act on her warnings in his own quiet way. He made sure every gun had a double supply of ammunition right next to it, not back in the supply dump. He had the men dig their foxholes a little deeper. He made sure every weapon was perfectly clean, every gas mask was in working order. He was preparing for the storm that only he and Maggie seemed to see coming. The weather grew colder. A thick, wet snow began to fall, blanketing the forest in a pristine, beautiful layer of white. The silence deepened. The world seemed to shrink, the trees closing in around them. And then the fog rolled in, a dense, soupy mist that cut visibility to less than 50 yards. It was a disorienting, claustrophobic world of gray and white. Communications with the outside world began to fail. The telephone lines to headquarters became intermittent, then went dead completely. The radios were filled with a strange, confusing mix of static and faint, distorted German voices. They were cut off, an isolated island in a sea of fog. Lieutenant Wallace became increasingly agitated. His perfect, orderly world was falling apart. Without contact with his superiors, without new orders, he was lost. His only response was to cling even more tightly to his last known instructions, to hold their position and observe. On the morning of December 16th, the world exploded. The ground began to shake. A low, continuous roar, deeper and more powerful than anything they had ever heard, rolled through the forest. It was not the sharp crack of their own guns. This was a sound of immense, world-ending violence. The entire German army was bombarding the American lines. Through the fog and the falling snow, they could see flashes of light, the ripple of explosions, the angry red glow of distant fires. The ghost front was a ghost no longer. It was the epicenter of a massive, terrifying German offensive. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The men, shocked and terrified, scrambled for their guns. But Lieutenant Wallace was frozen. His neat, clean maps were useless. The manual had no chapter for this. He had no orders. He paced back and forth in the command tent like a caged animal, screaming into a dead radio, demanding instructions, demanding a plan. Maggie was not in the command tent. She was on the gun line. She had abandoned her post in the motor pool the moment the first shell fell. She stood by the breech of her old gun, the Long Tom, and she stared out into the thick white fog. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. She could feel the vibration in the frozen earth, the rhythmic heavy tremor of hundreds of tons of steel moving through the forest. They were coming, and they were coming right for them. The German artillery barrage was a thing of methodical, terrifying fury. It walked its way up the valley, a moving wall of explosions that chewed the forest to splinters. Shells screamed overhead, their sound ripping the foggy air apart. The ground bucked and shuddered. The American soldiers, stunned and deafened, pressed themselves into the frozen earth of their foxholes, praying for it to stop. Lieutenant Wallace was a man undone. The chaos of the barrage, the complete loss of communication, the sheer, overwhelming violence of the attack had shattered his rigid, orderly world. He was a man trained to follow a plan, and the plan had just been blown to pieces. He stumbled out of the command tent, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and indecision. "Hold your fire!" he screamed, his voice thin and reedy against the roaring backdrop of the explosions. "Do not return fire until we have a target confirmed. We don't know where they are." "You'll give away our position." Master Sergeant Miller looked at the young officer with open contempt. "Sir," he yelled back over the din, "they ain't exactly being subtle about where they are. They're everywhere! If we don't shoot back, they're just gonna walk right over us." But Wallace was trapped in a prison of his own making. The manual was clear. Artillery does not fire without a confirmed target from a forward observer. Their observers were all silent, their telephone lines cut. To fire blindly into the fog was, in his mind, the greatest sin an artilleryman could commit. It was undisciplined. It was wasteful. It was wrong. The barrage lifted as suddenly as it had begun. An eerie, ringing silence descended, broken only by the crackle of burning trees and the quiet moans of the wounded. The men slowly picked themselves up, their faces smudged with dirt, their ears ringing. They stared out into the thick, white curtain of fog, their knuckles white on their rifles and carbines. And then they heard it. It started as a low rumble, the sound Maggie had been hearing for weeks, now magnified 100 times. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. It was the sound of tank treads chewing up the frozen ground, the squeal of bogie wheels, the roar of powerful Maybach engines, and it was getting closer. Out of the fog, like great gray beasts emerging from a prehistoric mist, came the tanks. They were not the tired, second-rate tanks they had been told to expect. The first one to emerge was a Panther, its long, deadly 75mm cannon sniffing the air, its thick, sloped armor making it look like an angry, steel predator. Behind it was another Panther and behind them, the wider, more menacing shapes of the legendary Tiger tanks. It was the spearhead of a full-scale Panzer division, an armored fist aimed directly at the heart of their position. The Germans had found a weakness, a forgotten logging trail that the American planners had deemed impassable for heavy armor. And now a column of 50 tons of German steel was about to roll right over one unprepared, unsupported American artillery battery. The American soldiers froze, their blood turning to ice water in their veins. They had no anti-tank guns. Their bazookas were useless against the frontal armor of a Panther or a Tiger. Their rifles and machine guns might as well have been pea shooters. They were dead men. Lieutenant Wallace stared at the impossible sight, his mouth hanging open. He was completely, utterly paralyzed. He could not process what he was seeing. It was not supposed to be happening. It was not in the plan. "Hold your fire," he stammered, the order a pathetic, reflexive squeak. They might be. He couldn't even finish the sentence. But Maggie Suttree was not frozen. In that moment of absolute terror, a strange, cold calm washed over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a clarity so pure it was like a shard of ice in her soul. This was the moment she had been born for. This was the problem she knew how to solve. She was already at her gun, the Long Tom. The gun crew, the same boys who had called her the witch, looked at her, their young faces a mask of terror, searching for an answer she did not have. But they saw the look in her eyes. It was a look of absolute, unshakable certainty. "Load high explosive," she said, her voice not loud but clear and sharp as a rifle crack. It was not a request. It was a command. The loader, a boy named Santini from Brooklyn, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking toward the paralyzed Lieutenant Wallace. "Now!" Maggie snapped, her certainty cut through his fear. He and the rest of the crew moved, their months of training taking over. They opened the breech, slid the massive 95-pound shell into the chamber, and slammed the breech block shut. The gun was ready. Maggie was on the gunner's sight. The lead Panther was now less than 500 yards away, lumbering up the gentle slope toward their position. It was a ridiculously close range for a gun that could fire over 14 miles. It was like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" Wallace shrieked, finally snapping out of his trance. "You do not have a fire command. I am ordering you to stand down." "Corporal, I am ordering you to step away from that gun." Maggie ignored him. She did not even hear him. Her world had shrunk to the crosshairs of the sight and the gray, menacing shape of the lead tank. She did not use the rangefinder. She did not calculate the trajectory. She knew. She could feel the path the shell would take. She could see the beautiful, deadly arc it would scribe through the foggy air. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Long Tom was a physical blow, a concussion that kicked up a storm of snow and dirt. For a few heartbeats, the world was nothing but the thunder of the gun and the acrid smell of burnt cordite. Then, through the fog, they saw the result. The 95-pound high-explosive shell, designed to obliterate concrete bunkers, struck the lead Panther tank directly on its turret. The shell didn't just penetrate the armor. It shattered it. The tank seemed to leap into the air, its turret blown clean off its chassis, spinning through the air like a discarded toy. A massive secondary explosion tore the rest of the tank apart in a blossoming flower of orange flame and black smoke. The burning, twisted wreck of the lead tank now sat squarely in the middle of the narrow forest road, completely blocking the path of the column behind it. The crew stared, their faces lit by the fire, their mouths agape. They had never seen anything like it. "Again!" Maggie commanded, her voice cutting through their awe. "Target second tank. Load armor piercing!" They moved, a single efficient organism of muscle and steel. They loaded the heavy, solid-shot, armor-piercing round. The second Panther was trying to crawl off the road to get around the burning wreck of its leader. Maggie adjusted the sights. A flick of the wrist on the elevation wheel, a slight turn of the traverse. She fired again. The armor-piercing round struck the second tank in its side armor, punching through the steel as if it were cardboard. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from the entry hole. A moment later, a hatch opened, and the surviving crew bailed out, their uniforms on fire. "Again!" Maggie yelled, her voice raw. For the next 10 minutes, Maggie Suttree, the quiet corporal from West Virginia, fought her own private war. She worked the gun with a speed and a fury that was both terrifying and magnificent. She became the vengeful spirit of the forest, the long tom her instrument of destruction. She fired without orders, without charts, without hesitation. She fired by feel, by instinct, by the cold, hard certainty in her soul. She used a mix of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. She hit the third tank and the fourth. She walked her fire down the column, which was now a trapped, panicked traffic jam of steel. The German crews, unable to advance, unable to retreat, were sitting ducks. Some tried to abandon their vehicles and were cut down by the American machine gunners, who had finally found their courage. Lieutenant Wallace stood behind the gun pit, screaming. He was screaming at her to stop, screaming that she was disobeying a direct order, screaming that she would be court-martialed, that she would be shot. No one was listening to him. The men were listening to Maggie. They were watching a miracle. When it was over, the valley floor was a vision from hell. A dozen German tanks and half-tracks were burning, their thick black smoke coiling up into the gray, foggy sky. The spearhead of the German attack had been broken. The breakthrough had been stopped before it had even begun. It had been stopped by one gun and by one woman who had dared to trust what she knew. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than the silence that had come before. The men of the battery slowly lowered their weapons. They looked at the carnage in the valley, and then they looked at Maggie. She was leaning against the breech of the still-hot cannon, her small frame trembling, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Lieutenant Wallace stormed up to her, his face a purple mask of rage. He didn't see a hero. He saw a mutineer. "You are under arrest, Corporal," he hissed, his voice shaking with fury. "For gross insubordination in the face of the enemy. You disobeyed a direct order. I will see you hang for this." He grabbed her arm. But before he could drag her away, a massive hand clamped down on his shoulder. It was Master Sergeant Miller. He spun the lieutenant around. "You touch her," Miller said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "and you'll have to arrest me too, and every other man in this battery." The standoff at the gun pit was a short, silent battle of wills. Lieutenant Wallace looked from Master Sergeant Miller's granite-hard face to the grim, determined expressions of the enlisted men. He saw in their eyes that their loyalty was no longer his. It belonged to the small, exhausted woman leaning against the cannon. Defeated, he dropped his hand from Maggie's arm. He had lost his authority, and he knew it. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a strange, surreal limbo. The German offensive had bypassed their position, seeking softer targets, leaving them isolated on their ridge behind the new, bulging front line. They were an island in a sea of enemies. Wallace retreated into a sullen, bitter silence, confining himself to the command tent. He had been disobeyed and humiliated, and his mind was now focused on one thing: revenge. He began meticulously documenting Maggie's insubordination, preparing the report that he was sure would lead to her court-martial. Master Sergeant Miller, with Maggie's quiet tactical advice, took effective command of the battery. They fortified their position, rationed their supplies, and tended to their wounded, waiting for the American counterattack to relieve them. For 3 days they lived in the wreckage of the battle, the burned-out hulks of the German tanks a constant, grim reminder of what Maggie had done. To the men of the battery, she was a living legend. They treated her with a quiet, profound reverence, bringing her extra rations, making sure she had the warmest spot by the fire. She was their savior. When the American advance finally broke through and relieved them, the story of their stand had already begun to spread. It was a whisper at first, a wild rumor of a single artillery battery that had single-handedly stopped a Panzer column. But the evidence was there. smoking and twisted, on the valley floor. Lieutenant Wallace saw his chance. The moment they re-established contact with headquarters, he formally charged Corporal Suttree. The charges were as serious as they could be. Willful disobedience of a lawful order from a superior officer in a combat zone. It was a crime punishable by death. Maggie was formally arrested and sent back to a rear echelon base to await her trial. The men of her battery were furious, but there was nothing they could do. The wheels of military justice had begun to turn. The court-martial was held in a cold, makeshift courtroom in a requisitioned schoolhouse in Bastogne. It was a grim, serious affair. The prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious major, laid out the case with brutal simplicity. The law was the law, an order was an order. He presented Lieutenant Wallace as a prudent, by-the-book officer, trying to maintain discipline in a chaotic situation. He painted Maggie as a panicked, rogue soldier whose reckless actions, while coincidentally successful, had endangered her entire unit by firing without a clear command. Wallace, on the stand, was a convincing witness. He spoke of the importance of fire discipline, of the fog of war, of the danger of giving away their position. He omitted the fact that he had been paralyzed by fear and indecision. In his telling, he was the voice of reason, and Maggie was the voice of mutiny. When Maggie took the stand, she was quiet and dignified. She did not speak of her gift, of the feeling in her bones. She knew they would not understand. She spoke only of the facts. She described the size of the tanks, their speed, the imminent danger. "There was no time, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. "If we had waited for an order, we would have been overrun. We would all be dead." But her logic was no match for the rigid letter of the law. The three grim-faced colonels on the judicial panel looked at her not with sympathy, but with the cold appraisal of men whose entire world was built on a foundation of obedience. It was clear which way the verdict was leaning. The trial was nearing its conclusion. The prosecutor was making his final damning summary. Maggie sat beside her young, out-of-his-depth defense lawyer, a profound sadness settling over her. She had saved them all, and she was going to be punished for it. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man strode in who seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He was a two-star general, his uniform immaculate, his face weathered and severe. On his shoulder was the patch of the Third Army. It was General George S. Patton's chief of staff. He strode to the front of the courtroom, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I apologize for the interruption, Colonel," he said to the head of the panel. "But I have evidence that is pertinent to this case." He handed a file to the colonel. "We have spent the last week interrogating the commander of the Panzer division that was stopped at this corporal's position. We have also recovered his battle plans." The general turned and looked at the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the prosecutor, over Wallace, and finally settling on Maggie. "According to the captured German commander," the general announced, his voice booming through the silent room, "the tank column this corporal engaged was not a probing attack. It was the primary armored spearhead of the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive. Their objective was to seize the bridge at the town of Noville, which would have allowed 3 full Panzer divisions to pour into our rear, cutting off the 101st Airborne in Bastogne and potentially collapsing the entire American line in the Ardennes." A shocked murmur went through the courtroom. The general continued, his voice like iron. "The German battle plan was brilliant. It relied on one thing, speed. They used a route our own intelligence had deemed impassable. They knew that if they could get through that one valley before we could react, the battle was theirs. They had allowed exactly 30 minutes for the entire column to clear that sector." He turned and pointed a finger directly at Maggie. "This corporal did not just save her battery. She did not just stop a tank column. By firing when she did, at that exact moment, without waiting for an order that would have come too late, she single-handedly broke the back of the entire German offensive in this sector. She did not just save a few dozen lives. She saved the lives of 10,000 men. She saved Bastogne. She may very well have saved the outcome of this entire battle." He then turned his cold, furious gaze on Lieutenant Wallace, who looked as if he had been turned to stone. "And you, Lieutenant," the general snarled, "are a disgrace. Your cowardice and indecision in the face of the enemy nearly cost this army a victory. Your attempt to scapegoat a hero to cover for your own failure is the most contemptible act I have ever witnessed in my 30 years of service." The courtroom was in an uproar. The verdict was now a foregone conclusion. The charges against Maggie were dismissed with a full and public apology from the court. Lieutenant Wallace was stripped of his command on the spot and would face his own court-martial for cowardice and perjury. The story ends 2 weeks later on a snow-covered hill overlooking the same valley. The burned-out hulks of the tanks are still there, a monument to what happened. A small ceremony is taking place. The general himself is there. He calls forward Corporal Maggie Suttree. In front of the entire cheering battery, he pins the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest award for valor, to her uniform. Then he does something unexpected. He hands her a small velvet box. Inside are the gold bars of a second lieutenant. The Army has a critical shortage of officers with your kind of feeling for the battlefield, Lieutenant Suttree, the general says, a rare, gruff smile on his face. Your first command will be as the new chief of gunnery instruction for this entire artillery group. Your job is to teach them how to shoot. Teach them the book, but also teach them what you know. Teach them to listen. Maggie looks out over the valley, the heavy metal on her chest, the gold bars in her hand. She had come to the war a quiet, underestimated girl from the mountains. She had been insulted, humiliated, and nearly broken by a system that had no room for her gift. But in the crucible of battle, her quiet truth had roared louder than any cannon. She had not only saved the day, she had proven that the most powerful weapon in any army is not a gun, but the unbreakable courage of a single soldier who dares to be right.